GETTYAngela Merkel under fire. Germany restricts Chancellor's eurozone reforms. A draft resolution for German lawmakers drawn up by leading members of Mrs Merkel's conservative bloc rejects plans floated by the Executive European Commission to make use of a specific EU legal provision to create a European Monetary Fund (EMF), documents seen by Reuters show. Instead, the Conservatives say that setting up an EMF under European law would require treaty change, in consultation with national parliaments, a tricky feat that would take time and is likely to frustrate Mr Macron, who visits Berlin later this week. An insider close to the French president said, "I know that Macron is pushing Merkel and she is not moving in the way he thinks she should be moving." The source went on to say that Mr Macron may have to adopt a more confrontational tone with Germany, adding, "His basic point will have to be, I'm spending a lot of capital in France to modernize the country. I promised that I would do this and I'm delivering. This is a credit that has to be paid." By floating the resolution ahead of the French president's working meeting with Mrs Merkel on Thursday, the Conservative lawmakers are flexing their muscles in a bid to safeguard the Bundestag's ability to veto eurozone aid packages and restricting reform of the bloc. Their go-slow approach, born of angst about German taxpayers' money being used to fund expensive EU projects, limits Mrs Merkel's capacity to reform. A French finance ministry source said, "This is going to be a decisive week if we are going to come up with something by June." Last month, an important announcement which was set to unveil plans for a reformed eurozone was cancelled after Mrs Merkel struggled to find time to discuss the blueprints with Mr Macron while negotiating a coalition government. GETTYAngela Merkel and Mr Macron were forced to admit that the announcement had been pushed back to June. Mrs Merkel and Mr Macron had promised last December to present joint plans for a eurozone reform in March. However, the pair were forced to admit that the announcement had been pushed back to June. An EU official at the time told Germany's Der Spiegel magazine, "The matter has been cancelled. There is simply nothing to announce." The German Chancellor, whose political capital is depleted after she lost support in last September's national election, has faced fierce resistance from her conservatives to any reforms that would see German taxpayers assume liability for other countries' debts. Mr Macron was elected last May on a promise to overhaul the EU and has called for the eurozone to have its own budget and finance minister. "I know that Macron is pushing Merkel, and she is not moving in the way he thinks she should be moving," insider close to Emmanuel Macron. But at a meeting on Monday, the Executive Committee of Merkel's Christian Democrats, CDU, made it clear that eurozone reforms were not a priority as they focus on plugging the EU funding black hole left by Brexit. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, CDU Secretary-General, said a eurozone budget was not a priority, adding, "I don't think that would make sense." In their draft resolution, Mrs Merkel conservative bloc called for a parliamentary working group to present a draft bill on the EMF issue by the end of April, with plans for German lawmakers to vote on it in June. Finance Minister Olaf Scholz, a member of Mrs Merkel's coalition partner, the Social Democrats, Mrs Merkel's coalition partner, praised Mr Macron's courage in proposing eurozone reforms but added that some were not feasible. In a proposal for discussion at a meeting of the Conservative parliamentary bloc on Tuesday, the group's deputy leader, Kaci Likert, stressed that individual eurozone member states must remain liable for their own risks. The draft resolution said, financial aid will only be granted with strict conditions, adding that German lawmakers must retain the right to decide on granting financial aid to other eurozone member states.